In the summer of 1914, as World War I was beginning, Margaret Sanger was indicted by the U.S. government for articles in her outspoken publication, The Woman Rebel. Once in court, it became apparent that she was to be railroaded into prison without the opportunity to defend herself or her cause. Concerned friends helped her to flee to England. There she remained for the next year, researching and preparing her defense, while in the States, birth control was gaining in popular support. With renewed hope, she returned to America. A new trial date was set, and on the eve of her trial, a dinner was given on her behalf at the prestigious Hotel Brevoort in New York City. We take you now to the Hotel Brevoort on the evening of January 17, 1916, where Margaret Sanger is beginning her address.
Friends, to me this evening and this gathering are especially significant, not only because birth control is being supported by you, who are so diverse a group, but because of the moment I am in, the eve of my trial in federal court. I am accused of willfully breaking federal law. I am accused of advocating anarchism and assassination. I am accused of deserting my husband and abandoning my children. And I am accused of attending this dinner, thereby betraying the working-class women of the world who most need my help. Yes, I did deliberately defy federal law. I did publish The Woman Rebel, a newspaper said to advocate anarchism and assassination. I did leave my husband and my children, and I have eaten a lovely dinner here tonight. To these accusations I plead guilty. But that I have betrayed the women of the world, I will leave that for you to hear me and to judge. While the wealthy both advocate and practice birth control, the poor are left to their own devices that leave them with large unplanned families. I am familiar with the joys of a large family. I was number 6 of 11 children, only one of whom my mother buried. We grew up in Corning, New York, in the flats near the factories of Corning glass. I noticed as a child that the people on the flats, the factory people, had large families, many children, that those on the hills had few, that the people with large families lived with poverty, toil, unemployment, drunkenness, cruelty, quarreling, fighting, debts, jail sentences. The people with small families lived on the hilltops. Their mothers were young-looking with pretty, clean dresses. The children on the hill were free to romp and play. In conduct they were open and unafraid. They even smiled and talked to the passing policeman. And they took possession of the best in life as a matter of course. We, the children of poorer parents, were made to feel inferior. We were burdens and dependent on others for our existence. Mother was proud of 11 children. I used to hear her say with pride, "Not one of 'em born with a blotch, mark, or blemish." We had heard of babes in the neighborhood being born sick. I saw such a baby in the arms of a terrified woman, a mother with 9 more children at home, whose husband had thrown the wailing, naked infant into the snow. The child had eczema and screamed day and night. I remember having great sympathy for that father. I could picture him returning home after a hard day's work, 10 or 12 hours on the job, to a household shrieking with the cries of that suffering baby and the noise of 9 other children. Quite beside himself for want of sleep and desperate for quiet, his nerves overcame him, and out of the door into the snow the nuisance went. In our house, home study was impossible. There were always children to be put to bed, to be rocked to sleep, feet, knees, and hands to be washed. Then the older members of the family took the warm living room to discuss their doings. How could lessons be learned in such an atmosphere? Nevertheless, I learned my lessons because I wanted to do so. Because I did learn my lessons, my older sister sent me to Claverack Institute, a Methodist school in the Catskill Mountains. I was interested in social questions. I was ardent for women's rights, for woman's emancipation. The paper I wrote on that question was to be read in chapel. I studied as never before. I stole away to the cemetery and stood on the monuments of the graves. And again in the quiet of the dead, I repeated my speech aloud. What a speech it was! Boys shouted at me, drew pictures of me wearing men's clothes and smoking huge cigars. And I became known even then for my advanced ideas. After graduation, I had just begun my first job teaching school when I was abruptly summoned home to attend Mother, who had been growing thinner and more frail since the last baby was born. For years, she had been a consumptive. Now she was so ill she had to be carried from room to room, and her body was shaken constantly by a racking cough. Mother died on the 31st of March, a tubercular who had borne 11 children and miscarried 7. She was 49 years of age. Father lived to be 88. 6 months after my mother's death, I was accepted as probationer in nurses training in a small new hospital in Westchester County. I hoped to go to medical school to become a doctor. But as I was completing my postgraduate studies, I was swept off my feet by a handsome, intense artist. William Sanger took me out one Sunday for what I thought was a ride in the country and returned me to my boarding house married. Only a year later, our son Stuart was born, and now the consumption that had plagued my mother came into my life also. There was a long, serious conference at the sanatorium. Dr. Trudeau advised that I be separated from all personal responsibility, that my sister and my husband's mother come and arrange for the future care of the baby, that I be kept completely quiet. Gradually, I came to realize that preparations were really being made for a long, lingering illness and for death. My death. That night I went to bed, but I could not sleep. All that night long I kept repeating to myself, I won't die, I won't die. When the first glimmer of dawn appeared through the curtains, I went into the bedroom where the baby and the nurse were sleeping. I woke her and told her we were leaving the sanatorium and going back to New York City. We were met at Grand Central Station by a much surprised and confused husband who rejoiced my heart by exclaiming, "That's right, get away from that sanatorium. You won't die. I won't let you die." For 3 weeks, I fasted. I refused to eat any food whatsoever, and I drank only water. At the end of 3 weeks, I began to take an interest in food, and gradually I became well enough to care for my baby and go on with my life. And now we wanted a home. We purchased a half-acre in Hastings-on-Hudson and rented a little house nearby so that my architect husband could supervise the new construction. For weeks we worked on what we called our rose window. It was to surmount the open staircase that led up from the library. With our own hands, every petal was cut, leaded, welded together. We were certain we would live the rest of our lives beneath the beauty of this window. At last, the rose window was in place, rugs down, furniture set, curtains hung. It was like a welcome home. Excited but weary, at 1 a.m, we fell into bed. Only a few hours later, we were rudely awakened by a pounding on the bedroom door. "Madam, madam, come, a fire in the big stove." Our new house was on fire. I carried my terror-stricken son Stuart to the top of the staircase. Flames were leaping through one side of it. I threw my bathrobe over my son's head and, pressing close to the far wall, we descended to safety. My husband ran in his nightclothes to sound the alarm. The nearest telephone was half a mile away. I crossed the street to my neighbors, tucked my youngster into an impromptu bed, and from the window of their home looked out on the street. It was a moonlit night in February. It had rained earlier. and on the branches of the trees and shrubbery the rain had frozen into sparkling crystals that glinted in the light of the fire. It was fantastic, unbelievably beautiful, a fairy tale setting. Directly across from me stood our house, a light, glowing horribly in the moonlight. The flames danced, flickering relentlessly, and as if directed by sheer devilish intent, spurted directly through our beautiful rose window. One by one, petal by petal, fell into the frozen snow. I recalled our cut fingers, our bleeding hands, our fatigued eyes. It had taken so long to weld those petals together. I watched on as the flames danced, and somewhere in the back of my mind I saw the senselessness, the futility of putting all of one's hopes, all of one's effort into something that could perish irretrievably in the course of a few minutes. Fortunately, part of the house was fireproof, and while there was damage, there was quick restoration. Our lives went on, apparently unchanged by the fire and the loss of the rose window. Another 4 years brought a second son, Grant. And 20 months later, my long-desired daughter, my beautiful Peggy, so full of vivacity and intelligence. And with these children came an overwhelming desire to be in the center of life's activities, to be involved in working for humanity. When the first chance came to sell, we let the house go. We left that suburban tranquility of Hastings-on-Hudson, and in the fall of 1911, we moved our 3 children into the bustle of life in New York City. Once there, we faced financial difficulties. I had the good fortune to have the children's paternal grandmother living with us, and I returned to nursing. I took special obstetrical cases assigned me, and I soon had intimate glimpses into the lives of women, particularly the lives of poor women, women always weary, women always hungry, toiling to give food to 4 or 5 children, always hungry, women always pregnant, their undernourished bodies drained by the increasing demands of the next unborn child. Many of the women had asked for a way to limit their families, but there was a law, the Comstock Law, which forbade any discussion of contraception. Over and over I heard of their futile attempts at bringing themselves round, drinking various herb teas, taking drops of turpentine on sugar, seaming over a chamber of boiling water or turpentine water, rolling down stairs, inserting slippery elm sticks or shoe hooks or knitting needles into the uterus. Working daily with these horrors, my own comfortable life became a reproach. These other lives clutched, claimed my thoughts day and night. Finally, the thing began to shape itself, to become utterly clear during the 3 weeks I spent in the home of a desperately sick woman living on Grand Street in Lower East Side. Mrs. Sachs was very young. Her husband, an unskilled worker. 3 children, 5, 3, and 1, were none too strong nor sturdy, and it took all the earnings of the father and the best ingenuity of the mother to care for them. Mrs. Sachs had again become pregnant. Frantic, she had used some instrument lent her by a friend. She was found prostrate and bloody on the floor, surrounded by the crying children when the husband returned from work. A little money had been saved, a nurse. I was cold, and the struggle for that precious life began. Never had I worked so fast, never so concentratedly as I did to keep alive that little mother. Never had I known such conditions. July's sultry days and nights were a torpid inferno. Ice, food, all necessities had to be carried up 3 flights. Everything for disposal had to be carried down 1 flight to the only toilet in the building. At the end of 3 weeks, recovery was in sight. And at the end of the month, I was preparing to leave my fragile patient. As the hour for my departure grew near, Mrs. Sachs appeared more and more anxious. Finally, she said, "Another baby will finish me, I suppose." "It's too early to talk about that," I replied. And when the doctor came, I told him, "Mrs. Sachs is worried about having another baby." "She well might be," said the doctor. Then, standing over the fragile patient, he said, "Any more such capers, young woman, and there'll be no need to call me." "Yes, yes, I know, doctor, but what can I do to prevent getting that way again?" "Ho, ho," said the doctor. "So you want your cake while you eat it too, do you?" Then, slapping her familiarly on the back and picking up his hat and bag, he said, "I'll tell you the only sure thing to do. Tell Jake to sleep on the roof." And with these jovial words, the doctor closed the door and went down the stairs. Mrs. Sachs turned to me, sheer horror stamped on her face. "He's only a man. He can't understand. But you're a woman. You understand. You'll tell me the secret, and I'll never tell it to another soul, I swear." But I didn't know the secret. Even as a nurse in 1912, I did not know the secret. And she would not believe that I really did not know. After a little she slept. I left. And I made up my mind I'd stay away from those cases in the future. Some time later, I was about to retire one night when the telephone rang. It was Mr. Sachs. He begged me to come immediately. I knew before I left the telephone it was useless for me to go. I arrived just after the doctor, the same one who had given such noble advice. Mrs. Sachs died within 10 minutes. It was the same story, only this time she consulted a $5 abortionist. I looked at the drawn face, now stilled in death, the crying children, the husband pacing the floor, moaning, "My God, my God, my God." I left that desolate home, and I walked and walked and walked. For hours and hours I walked, bag in hand, thinking, regretting, dreading. At 3 in the morning I entered my own home, exhausted. I went to the window and looked down on the dimly lit city, sleeping in its misery, crowded, dirty homes, filled with too many children, children neglected, hungry, children 6 and 7 years old working in factories, children, too many children, abused, beaten, unloved, unwanted. I watched the lights go out. I saw the darkness give way to the pale light of dawn. And with this dawn came my illumination also. All this misery had but one source. Too many children. Too many unwanted children. I released my bag from my almost paralyzed hand, threw it across the room, tore the uniform from my body. I would never again go back to nursing, to superficial cures. There was only one thing to be done: teach women how not to have children. And with this determination, I lay down and slept the first undisturbed sleep I had had in over a year. And when I arose, I announced to my family that I was done with nursing, that I would never again go on another case. And I never have. And now I sought myself to learn about contraception. I asked the doctors. I was told, "You better keep off of that subject or Anthony Comstock will get you." I was told, "There are laws against that sort of thing. Why, even doctors are jailed for giving contraceptive advice. It is legally classified as obscene." This was the reply from every medical man and woman I approached. I consulted the progressive women who called themselves feminists. They were scarcely able to keep from laughing at the idea of too many children. Anyway, they said, "You can't do a thing until we get the vote." Wherever I turned, I met the same reply. Wait until women get the vote. Wait for the social revolution. Wait for the industrial revolution. Only the boys of the IWW seem to understand the significance of this great social question. Big Bill Haywood suggested that I go to France and see for myself the conditions resulting from generations of family limitation. In France, I discovered that contraception was almost a national right. Not even the Catholic Church could stem its practice. But it was entirely an individual affair, and no French doctor taught contraception. I returned home more puzzled than ever over how to make information on contraception freely available to women. By this time, I realized that I was to fight alone the battle against Anthony Comstock's obscenity laws. I worked out a plan, a twofold plan. I took what money I could from my rapidly dwindling bank account and set up the first leg of my plan by publishing a monthly newspaper. I make no apologies for the Woman Rebel. It expressed exactly what I felt and thought at the time. I paid the printer's bills, and I made it as red and flaming as possible, a scathing denunciation of all organized conventionalities. It was published first and foremost to feel out the authorities on the Comstock national law, and secondly to gather friends and supporters to the cause. The gathering was immediate. Within 6 months we had over 10,000 requests for information on contraception. As to the former, feeling out the federal authorities. One Monday morning, after the children were washed and dressed and off to school, I began my day's work by looking over my huge stack of mail. My attention was immediately caught by an unstamped envelope from the post office. I tore it open. "Dear Madam," I read, "you are hereby notified that the solicitor of the Post Office Department has declared the Woman Rebel unmailable under Section 489 U.S. Postal Laws and Regulations." It was signed E.M. Morgan, postmaster. I read it again. At first, the import of its contents did not register on my brain. And then I realized the fight was on. Immediately, articles on the necessity for birth control were featured more aggressively in the Woman Rebel. In response, the May, July, and August issues were quickly suppressed by the postmaster. During all these months, while the Woman Rebel was attracting attention and baiting authorities, I was hard at work on the second leg of my plan, writing a pamphlet entitled Family Limitation, in which was offered practical contraception information. I naively believed that the feminists and the suffragists, when they had read its sensible advice, would join in this crusade and challenge the absurdity of labeling information on contraception as obscene. I was to undergo many disappointments in this regard. I took my manuscript to a printer well known for his courage and liberal point of view. He read my manuscript, turned deathly pale, and said, "That can never be printed, Margaret. It's a Sing-Sing job. I'll go straight to jail." During the next 2 weeks, I visited at least 20 printers. No one would touch my manuscript. It is a marvelous thing to be a fanatic. No obstacle could deter me. Eventually, I found a printer who did the linotype work after hours, when the shop was supposedly closed. 100,000 copies of Family Limitation were printed, transported, and stored in 3 different cities, ready for future circulation. And this was the second leg of my plan, to have mailed, at a signal from me, from my prison cell if necessary, the Family Limitation pamphlet to all who had requested it. For now the threat of a prison sentence hovered over me constantly. Late in August, I was awakened early one morning by an imperious ringing of the doorbell. Opening the door, I was confronted by 2 agents of the Department of Justice, a legal document thrust into my hand. I tried to read it, threading my way slowly through the highly convoluted legal verbiage. Perhaps the words on the page were a bit blurred because of the slight trembling of my hands, but I managed to disentangle the chief point. I had been indicted on 9 counts by the grand jury for publishing obscenities. If found guilty, I could be sentenced to federal prison for as long as 45 years, fined as much as $45,000. To the agents, I protested. There is no information on contraception in the pages of the Woman Rebel, only a request for information. You have broken the law, they proclaimed. You had better submit quietly. I assured them I would do no such thing, that I intended making noise enough to resound from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. When I went to court as required, Judge Hazel, a kindly, fatherly man, allowed me to go on my own recognizance, and the case was adjourned to the end of October. This seemed sufficient time for me to prepare both a proper defense and for the care of my children, in case I should be sentenced to prison, for all assured me that I would go to prison. One kind woman, whom I had never before met, called very late one evening and offered to give me dancing lessons. She had worked out a routine suitable for a room the size of a jail cell, so that I could get my exercise in prison. Sometime later, I was suddenly summoned to the phone. I was told my case had been called that morning and I had not been present. The next morning I appeared in court and requested an extension. It was abruptly refused. I sensed a great change since I had first been in court. The judge was no longer kindly nor lenient. Something had happened. What it was, I half surmise. World War I was then rocking the very foundations of Europe. Germany's advance upon Paris was occupying the strained attention of every mind in America. It was an ideal time for a government to get any bother like birth control out of the way. The court's final decision was at 10 o'clock the following morning the case of the United States government against Margaret Sanger should go on without fail. It was now 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I had to think and act quickly. There was no doubt in my mind that if I were to present myself to that hostile court on the following morning, that I would be convicted of publishing obscenities and sentenced to 1 year, if not 45, in the federal penitentiary. But jail was not my goal. My goal was to challenge the Comstock laws and to make information on contraception freely available to women, to go to jail and not be heard, not be understood. I had seen better and hardier souls than I broken in body and spirit by prison terms. Then there was a question of the children. Could I leave them the heritage of a mother who had been sentenced, who had been sent to jail for some obscure newspaper? I realized that if I wanted to be heard, if I wanted to be understood, if I wanted to prepare a decent defense, the only thing I could do would be sail to Europe, stay there until the war was over, and return then to fight it out in the courts. The train from Montreal would leave in a few hours. Could I make it? Should I make it? Could I ever make my family, my children, understand why I had left them? Could I ever make anyone understand? At midnight, I boarded the train for Montreal, leaving behind all that was dear to me. Stuart, almost 11 years old. Grant, my 6-year-old Grant. And Peggy, my little 4.5-year-old daughter. I sailed from Montreal on the RMS Virginian. 3 days out at sea, I sent a cable and shortly had one in reply that as I was crossing the Atlantic, 100,000 copies of Family Limitation, my pamphlet on contraception, were being mailed simultaneously. As I was crossing the Atlantic, women all over America were receiving obscene information on contraception. Now I had truly broken the Comstock laws. I arrived at Liverpool, in November. A piercing chill penetrated the houses, the rooms, my bed. I was homesick, lonesome for the children as I'd never been in my life before. I made my way to London and to the British Museum, there to research and prepare my defense. Regularly, I was at the gate first thing in the morning. Usually I was the last to leave at night. Day after day, I studied and pored over books and articles and magazines, fascinated with my findings, reassured of the necessity of my work. But my enthusiasm was fairly stalked by an insistent, persistent fear that all was not well at home. At night, I would hear Peggy's voice. "Mother, Mother, are you coming back?" In the morning, I would awaken to a great dread and to a consciousness of the number 6. The 6 would repeat itself over and over in my sleepy brain. I would try to fit 6 into some event of the day, the 6th day of the week, or a sixpence, or 6 o'clock, or the sixpence the price of tea. Anything to take away the terrible dread that came with the consciousness of the 6. One morning I awoke to see a leaf on a wall calendar for the month of November, and on the leaf a 6, November 6. And still night after night I would hear Peggy's voice, "Mother, Mother, are you coming back?" But to obey that voice was impossible. I had come away from all I loved to accomplish a task. I had considered the consequences. And I believed that those who had love for you preferred you not to return with whines and excuses for failing your task, no matter what ensued. Alas, I could not answer that voice. And then late in the summer came word of a new supportive attitude towards birth control in America. Everywhere was the greatest interest in my work. Family limitation, my pamphlet on contraception was being copied, circulated, republished. I was being asked to return and take up the cause. On a bleak day in September, I set sail. With lights dimmed to avoid attracting attention of the German submarines, the ship plowed through the darkness of the Atlantic. My own thoughts were as dark. A presentiment of evil enveloped me. At last, the lights of Staten Island, blinking like specters in the autumn mist, signaled our safe arrival in New York Harbor. The old ship sidled along the docks of West 14th Street on the cold, gray morning of October 16, 1915. Home, at last. I picked up my traveling bag and walked away from the docks. I passed a small newsstand. There, on the cover of the Pictorial Review, were the words, "Birth Control." It was odd to be welcomed not by family nor friends, but by the very words that had sent me into exile. I cannot describe the joy of being reunited with my children. Stuart, almost 12 now. My 7-year-old Grant, and Peggy, my little 5.5-year-old daughter. A few days later, I informed the district attorney of my return and inquired if the indictments against me were still pending. I was politely assured they were. My case for trial was set for tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. In my absence, a National Birth Control League had been organized. I learned that this new league had been given all my files, including my list of the friends and subscribers of The Woman Rebel. I asked the league for a plain statement, what I might expect of them. I was told to call in the afternoon of the following week. At the appointed time, I called. It was then pointed out to me that the National Birth Control League was a legal, law-abiding organization, the purpose of which was to change the law in a legal, law-abiding manner. It stood to reason that a legal, law-abiding organization could not support a person who had broken the law. There was nothing to do but leave. On the way out, the chairman stopped me and asked, would I mind giving her the names and addresses of all those distinguished and socially prominent persons whom I had met in Europe, who were interested in my work, who might help the League. At the Academy of Medicine, a committee had been formed to consider the responsibility of physicians in regard to contraception, but at present, I was told, the committee was unsure of its position. $10 was sent towards the expense of my trial. Toward the end of October, Peggy fell ill. It was pneumonia. She did not respond to the care of physicians. Most of the time she lay in a deep sleep. Several times she looked at me and whispered, "Mother, Mother, are you coming back?" But when I answered her, she did not hear me. She would only whisper again, "Mother, Mother, are you coming back?" On November 6th, Peggy died. The bottom seemed to fall from the earth itself. Grief so dulled my faculties, I was unable to think. I went about as in a sleep from which I had no wish to awaken. I had never known how unforgettable to a mother is the loss of a child. News of my loss spread afar. I received hundreds, thousands of sympathetic letters from subscribers, old subscribers to the Woman Rebel. And with these letters came good news, women for the first time free of pregnancy, all due to my pamphlet, Family Limitation. And money came pouring in, sums from meager savings, and all urging me to carry on the fight. And so I am here today to carry on the fight for all women, to be heard that you may judge me for yourselves, to be heard that my daughter will not have died in vain. For I will be heard. I will speak. And though I face prison, I will be heard. And this our hapless mass of brutalized women, who for centuries have existed only as brood animals to the masculine civilizations of the world, whose sex servitude has made possible and perpetuated the tyrannies of the earth, created slums, bred prostitutes, filled prisons, supplied the mills with child labor, the fodder for cannon, the weary workers to be enslaved. These women will reclaim the destiny of their children. Motherhood will be a privilege, and every child will be wanted. Thank you.